Great to have you here this morning. And last week, we started a series that's going to take us right into the middle of March called Naked and Unashamed. And if you weren't here last week, I really want to encourage you to go to listen to last week's sermon online, because last week we talked about 6 road signs that were going to guide us on our journey. And those 6 road signs were no negative labeling, no throwing stones, people not issues, it's not a super sin. We need to wake up to the world in which we live, and we talked about the Bible. So I don't have time to go into this morning, but I really want to encourage you to go back and listen to that sermon if you weren't here last week. The whole point of this series, Naked and Unashamed, is very simple. We're trying to discover together a holistic, biblical, Jesus-centered vision of sex, human sexuality, and gender that honors God, blesses relationships, and offers good news to the world in which we live. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the first century. And really, this is a bit of a different sermon. It's really a history lesson that we're going to have this morning. And as we do that, we need to make sure that we don't read our 21st century postmodern understandings of human sexuality back into that world. The New Testament was not originally written to people living in a postmodern Western world. It was written to people steeped in first century Jewish or Greco-Roman culture. Thus, as I mentioned last week, it is so important for us to grasp the prevailing sexual culture of that day, because once we understand the culture of that day, we can then grasp what pertinent New Testament verses mean to those first hearers. They were living in that culture. The verses were written, the Bible, New Testament was written to them as they lived in that culture. Once we understand the culture, we can understand what those verses meant to those first hearers living in that culture, and then, and only then, we can move and those verses over to our culture and rightly apply the Scripture to our 21st century lives and understanding. And so this morning, we're going to go back to the first century and understand the world in which those first hearers lived. Now, I don't care how fixated you think our world is on sexual stuff. It has nothing compared to the first century Greco-Roman world. The first century Greco-Roman world was sexually promiscuous. Same-sex intercourse between adults and young boys, or just preteen boys, prostitution, were all the cultural norm. They were not only the cultural norm, they were celebrated. Rape of slaves was a given. Married men were expected to have affairs. There were very few sexual boundaries back then. Male prostitution directed towards other males was not only taxed in ancient Rome, but the amount of tax collected made up a significant portion of the royal treasury. First century Greco-Roman sexual culture can really be defined in 3 words. The first word is power. You could use the word domination if you want, but I'm using the word power. Most erotic relationships in the Greco-Roman world exhibited some sort of power differential. There was the dominant partner and the dominated person. There was the master and there was the slave. In the Roman mind, men were conquerors who dominated not only on the battlefield, but also in the bedroom. Thus, it was completely acceptable for a Roman male to have intercourse with men or women, provided he was the aggressor. Males of social standing were to be givers, not receivers of sexual intercourse. The gender of the receiver was largely irrelevant. A warrior could penetrate a conquered male enemy. A master could penetrate a household female slave. And those are both totally acceptable. Sexual intercourse with a male or a female was something a man did to someone as a way of expressing his power. And that was a good thing, not a bad thing. The second word is masculinity. We need to understand that the Greeks and the Romans did not understand sexuality in the terms of sexual orientation, which is a person's enduring sexual attraction to others, or in terms of gender identity, which is a person's self-identification as male or female, which may or may not be the same as their sex assigned at birth. Back then, they thought in terms of gender roles. The socially constructed distinction between male and female, between, as they would say, masculinity and femininity. In other words, they didn't ask questions like, is Mike gay? Or say things like, since Mike had sex with Frank, they must both be gay. They didn't think in those terms. What mattered to them was Mike manly or was Mike effeminate according to their culture? In terms of sexual activity, the Romans saw the insertive role in either anal or vaginal sex as masculine, and the receptor role as feminine. So if a man had an insertive role, in other words, if a man was using his penis in a sexual encounter with either a male or a female, he was acting as a masculine man, and that was a good thing. But if you were a male and you were a receptive partner in the anal sex act, you were considered effeminate. You were considered soft and weak, not powerful and masculine and dominating. So if you were a male and you were using your penis in a sex act, you were considered masculine and powerful, and that was something that was to be celebrated. So the first word is power. The second word is masculinity. And the third word, pedestry. Pedestry was a sexual relationship between an adult man and an adolescent boy. It was the most common form of same-sex relations in the Greco-Roman world. The word literally means the love of boys. It was a 1,000-year-old social tradition that enjoyed complete, and I mean complete, acceptance in both the Greek and Roman society. In many circles, it was considered the purest form of love. For the Greek world, sex was about the pursuit of beauty. And Greeks were captivated by the beauty of the young male form. Ancient Greek texts are full of references to same-sex intercourse with boys, because their beauty was the most striking to the eye. Greek men justified pedestry as a normal part of a boy's education. They saw the adult male as the teacher, and their role was to train the boy in matters of cultural and social expectations, in the ideals of manliness, and of course, sex. In Roman culture, the boys were learning to become Roman men. Men of power, men of masculinity. And so they were expected to be the receiver of an adult male's sexual advances. The pedestrian relationship usually ended when the boy reached puberty. Once he started to grow facial and body hair, the relationship would end. And while some men back there ran around trying to hump anyone or anything that couldn't run fast enough, it's wrong to say that all same-sex relationships were exploitive. That there is certainly some evidence of peer-to-peer same-sex relationships. There are some examples of same-sex marriages. Some men, some women engaged in same-sex relations that were mutual and consensual and interdependent and committed. Now, these were not the norm. They were the exception, not the norm. But they did exist. For example, Agathon, a famous Greek poet known for his physical beauty, was also known for dressing up like a woman. And he had a lifelong consensual lover named Pausanias. And their relationship began as pedestry, but it carried on from there for their lifetimes. So while they were the exception, committed same-sex relationships did occur. But certainly, sex in the first century Greco-Roman culture was more about masculinity and power than it ever was about love and commitment. Now, what about heterosexual marriage back then? How was that viewed in the Greek-Roman world? In both the Greek and Roman mind, the relationship between a man and a woman in marriage was not a union of equal. A man's wife was seen as beneath him and less than him. Women were considered weak. They were treated as second-class human beings, slightly more honored than slaves. A wife was under the authority of her husband. He had legal rights over her. In fact, back then, a wife's primary value was in her ability to have children. Divorce on the grounds of infertility seems to have been very common back then. And while a husband was legally free to exercise his male sexual desires in any way he wanted, so he could have sex with his wife, and then he could go out and have sex with a preteen boy. He could go out and have sex with males, females, prostitutes, slaves, you just name it. He could just sow his wild oats any way he wanted. It was different for the wife. A wife caught with another man would be charged with adultery. The penalty for adultery back then was, first, it allowed the husband to rape the male offender, and secondly, he had the option of killing his wife. He was legally obligated to at least divorce her. Such was heterosexual marriage in the first century Greco-Roman world. Now, you've got this Greco-Roman culture. Power, masculinity, celebrated. Men having sex with boys, celebrated. Marriage, not a union of equals. And so you've got this Greco-Roman culture, but also you had the Jewish culture in the first century. And what did the Jewish people think of all this? Well, the Jewish people in the first century did not approve of homosexual behavior. Many Jewish writers thought sexual intercourse was designed solely and completely for procreation. And since homosexuals couldn't procreate, homosexual unions were a non-starter for Jews in the first century. That, along with Old Testament teaching, the blurring of gender roles, the using your body in ways it wasn't intended to be used, and having men act like women, led the Jewish people to consider homosexual behavior in the first century as simply wrong. A prolific and respected Jewish writer of the time, Josephus, was Jewish to the core. He's a very Jewish guy, but he was also steeped in first century Greco-Roman culture. And he had much to say in his writings about same-sex relationships, and all of it was negative. For instance, Josephus was asked the question, what are our laws about marriage? His answer, the law owns no other mixture of sexes but that which is according to nature. Louis Crompton, a gay man and a pioneer in queer studies, wrote in his book, Homosexuality and Civilization, nowhere does any Jewish writer of this period imply the least acceptance of same-sex relations under any circumstances. the first century Jewish view was that same-sex relationships, as they understood them, were wrong. So you have this one culture, the Jewish culture, which looks over at the Greco-Roman culture and says what they're doing is wrong. And then you have the Greco-Roman culture, which is celebrating all kinds of sexual activity. And into this first century culture came a movement of people who followed a man named Jesus. And as their movement grew, it grew beyond its Jewish borders. In fact, most of the texts dealing with sexuality in the New Testament are written to Christ followers living in Roman cities, not Jewish cities. In other words, it was written to people who were living in this culture, the Greco-Roman culture, not people who were living in the Jewish culture. Let's quickly look at one example of what I'm talking about. The city of Corinth. The city of Corinth was founded around 800 BC. Its sexual promiscuity was legendary in the ancient world. While Corinth was under Greek control, the temple of Aphrodite was rumored to have had more than 1,000 slaves working there, which made Corinth back then the hub of sex tourism. In 146 BC, the city of Corinth was destroyed because it tried to revolt against Rome. Julius Caesar rebuilt the city in 44 BC. In New Testament time, the city was under Roman control. The temple to Aphrodite was considerably smaller than its heyday, but the culture of sexual promiscuity, which I've already talked about, still existed. And Paul goes to the city, and he starts a church there. And obviously, some of those who joined the church would have been influenced by the sexually promiscuous culture, attitudes, and activities of the city. There's no doubt that some in that new church would have been men who had had same-sex intercourse. It would have been men who had made use of prostitutes, men who had participated in the sexual abuse of slaves. When you understand the culture, and you understand that these new Christ followers came out of this culture into this new church, you understand why the church in Corinth struggled with sexual issues. And what I like is they struggled with it. They didn't exclude those people. And so Paul, because he started the church, wrote 2 letters to the church in Corinth. And I want to read you a few verses from the first letter he wrote, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 to 4. Now, for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Someone had asked Paul a question. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. And Paul answers. He says, but since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Paul says here, since sexual immorality is occurring. Now, the Greek word, the New Testament was originally written in Greek. The Greek word there, sexual immorality, it's one word, is used in the New Testament to refer to sex outside of marriage. And Paul says, since sexual immorality is occurring, and it was occurring everywhere in the city, right? Since it's occurring, Paul says to the Christ followers in Corinth, verse 2, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. Paul here was limiting sexual activity to opposite sex couples in marriage. His language in verse 2 points to monogamy, one husband, one wife. That relationship was to be the place where one's sexual desires were to be fulfilled. Do you see how countercultural his words were? He's saying to men, okay, the humping of boys, the going out for the male prostitutes, the female prostitutes, your slaves, and all that area where you're finding sexual fulfillment. No. As a Christ follower, in this church, he says, you're to go monogamous. And you're to find your sexual fulfillment with your wife. Did you understand how countercultural that was? And also look at, you got to see the sexual equality he brings in here in verse 3 and 4. Listen to what he says. Listen for the equality. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Now, when the word duty appears here, it's not appearing here in a negative sense. Paul is calling husbands and wives to respect each other and to respect each other's sexual desires. Let me read you verse 3 from the Message paraphrase. It says this: the marriage bed must be a place of mutuality. The husband seeking to satisfy his wife, the wife seeking to satisfy her husband. And then verse 3 and 4, let me read it from another version, the New Living Translation. It says this: the husband should fulfill his wife's sexual needs, and the wife should fulfill her husband's needs. The wife gives authority over her body to her husband, and the husband gives authority over his body to his wife. Do you see the equality here? Paul is addressing men and women on equal terms. And that's huge. He's saying to the husbands, your body is not there to do whatever you want to do with it. It's not there for you to go out with adolescent boys and prostitutes and slaves. He's saying it's not there for that. Your body is there for your wife, and your wife's body is there for you. Do you see the equality? In both Roman and rabbinical Jewish law, a woman's sexuality was essentially under the authority of her husband. But in Christianity, a woman found she was sexually equal with her husband in the marriage union. Isn't that awesome? Here women are oppressed in that culture, in the Jewish culture, in the Greco-Roman culture. They're oppressed. And along comes Paul, and he lifts them out of this oppression, and he says, you're equal. That's what I love about the New Testament. I read the Gospels, and I see Jesus lifting up women from oppression to freedom. I see Paul writing and saying, you're equal. You're not underneath your husband. You're not underneath your husband sexually. You're equal. Isn't that amazing? That was totally countercultural. And I think today the problem we have is our culture lifts women up from oppression, but sometimes the church can oppress them. The exact opposite. And we as a church should never be oppressing women. We should be lifting them up. Amen? Amen. Well, that was weak. Okay. Some of you disagree with me, but that's okay. I'm right. Okay, let's just get that out there. Do you see how countercultural this is? Paul's making a shift here. And he's saying particularly to the men, you're not to focus on yourself. You're to focus on the other. Back then, in that culture, men focused on themselves. It was all about my sexual fulfillment. Be it with boys, prostitutes, slaves. It's about me. Paul says, no. You're to focus on the other. And it was all about, as you've already heard me talk about, it was obvious that the sexual idea of power and masculinity was about taking, not giving. And Paul says, no. It's about giving, not taking. Paul was calling these new Christ followers to break away from the cultural norms and the values of their day. They were no longer to live by the sexual values of the Greco-Roman culture. They were now to live as kingdom people with kingdom values. Now, living by those values would have caused the Christ followers in Corinth to stand out like sore thumbs. I can only imagine how weird the early church must have appeared, like an Amish community planted in downtown Las Vegas. Outcasts, radicals, living by different values because they were living in a different kingdom. And so the question becomes, how should we then live in the 21st century? We live in a very different time. What first century Greco-Roman culture accepted and celebrated sexually, we as a culture, never mind a church, we as a culture consider wrong. If you're a man and you have sex with a boy that's 12, you're going to jail. We in our culture celebrate equality in marriage, including sexual equality. And power and masculinity from a sexual perspective are not okay. Harvey Weinstein, right? The Me Too movement. By the way, the church should get behind the Me Too movement. The church should speak out against any sexual harassment or sexual abuse, 100%. You see, so our culture wouldn't accept what went on in the first century. And while the first century may have been more sexually promiscuous, I would suggest to you that the 21st century is way more sexually complicated. So how are we as Christ followers to live in this sexually complicated world? Are we supposed to be like an Amish community in downtown Las Vegas? How are we to take Paul's words? Are we to take his words verbatim? Or he was writing to Christ followers living in Corinth. He wasn't necessarily writing to us. So how do we take his words? Do we take them literally? Or how do we apply them to the 21st century? Stay tuned. Same bat time, same bat channel. Here's what we're going to do. Next week, we're moving from the first century to the 21st century. Again, you're going to see in the weeks to come why it was so important we talked about the first century, but we're going to move to the 21st century next week, and we're going to talk about the 21st century culture and worldview, the Canadian 21st century culture and worldview, and we're going to zero in on one spot about that because we could spend weeks just talking about our worldview. We're going to zero in on one spot, the individual. Because the individual is central to understanding our culture's view and our culture's take on human sexuality. And then we're going to look at a Christian worldview. In light of the 21st century, in light of the first century, what is a Christian worldview? And then we're going to get to the issues. Now here's my plea, be patient. I know some of you are going, get to the issues. Come on, work with me. All right? Because here's the key. Here's where here's where people go sideways. When we don't create a great foundation and we just jump into the issues, things go off track. We've got to understand the first century world, and then we got to understand the 21st century world, and then we can move into the issues of heterosexuality, homosexuality, and transgender issues. We're getting there. Let me lay the foundation for you. All right, let's pray.